All right, hello everyone. Welcome to another video from the Church of Temple OS. And I'm here with my good friend Matt, also known as Varsity Bookworm. He runs a channel similar to mine here on YouTube. He has a bachelor's of philosophy and he's a really smart guy. So welcome, Matt, to the show.
Thanks, Austin. It's good to be here.
So, Matt, you have a very prominent and experienced background dealing with philosophy and moral issues. And you're running a series on your channel right now investigating Heaven's Gate. Can you tell us how that's going?
It's going good. Actually, in a few hours, the kind of final installment in this kind of got like a 6 episode series of kind of just audio recordings, kind of supposed to function as basically an overview of the soteriology, eschatology, and cosmology of Heaven's Gate. So what they think happens after death, how they think everything came into existence, and what they think is going to happen at the end of the age. Those are like kind of the three big ingredients in like virtually any religion. Um, and so the series is kind of based around those three concepts. And the last episode in that series is actually airing tonight. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Did you have any teachers or anything that really got you into this, or what was the catalyst?
When I went to school, I knew that I wanted to study philosophy, but I also knew that I was interested in religion. I've kind of always been interested in different religions. I really was attracted to any kind of like monastic or ascetic movements or individuals. So I loved reading books by like Thomas Merton. Um, I liked reading books about Ramana Maharshi, um, Paramahansa Yogananda, any of these like any of these kind of religious figures, contemporary religious figures. Those all the three guys I just mentioned are all 20th century people. I really liked more or less contemporary religious figures for whom their particular faith was like a 24/7 job. It wasn't just you go to church on Sunday and then the rest of the week you kind of do whatever. Philosophy teaches us how to inquire into what is good and what is bad. But when you're doing ethnography, sociology, anthropology, it's much more of a descriptive discipline. And I remember as an undergrad doing mostly philosophy courses, I almost always ended up running into some sort of issue in religious studies courses where I had my philosopher hat on too tightly. And I would either I would either get frustrated that we weren't making normative judgments, like I wanted to analyze like the morals of different groups and stuff. And not necessarily because I thought like, oh, this group is good or this group is bad. I think it was more that I was much more comfortable with philosophical language than I was with the academic study of religion. So I had at one time considered doing a minor in religious studies, and I ended up not doing that because I was too attached to being a philosopher. I thought that there was this sharp dichotomy between these two disciplines. Um, so I enjoyed studying religions, but I never imagined that I would devote much time to studying them academically. I kind of looked at it like, well, this is sort of a personal thing, so maybe my academic work will primarily be in philosophy. I finished my bachelor's up earlier this year, but a few months before I completed my program, I started getting interested in Heaven's Gate. And prior to that, I was never really interested in cults or new religious movements. Um, I don't know. I was just never attracted to that genre of work. Um, and I think there was something about Heaven's Gate that spoke to me.
Yeah, definitely. That's a question I wanted to ask you. So, what is a new religious movement and how does it differentiate from a traditional religion or an older religion?
I think maybe the best way actually to answer it for me is to focus on the group that I'm most familiar with at this point, which is Heaven's Gate. And this question of what is a new religion is a really tricky question, because for one thing, actually probably almost every new religion that I've looked into at all, they all kind of have this same idea that their religion actually isn't new in the first place. This is actually like one of the most interesting things about so-called new religious movements is this isn't a word that they came up with to describe themselves. This is something that academics came up with to describe the groups they're studying. But most new religious movements don't consider themselves to be new. And Heaven's Gate is a perfect example of that. Heaven's Gate considers themselves to be basically an update to Christianity. Heaven's Gate is kind of informed by this sort of dispensationalism that kind of took hold in the United States in the, I don't know, 19th century, I guess. And underpinning that is sort of this idea that God's relationship with his creation goes through these sort of stages of evolution. So the relationship or the covenant between God and his people took on a certain character in the form of his relationship with Adam and Eve. And then we screwed that one up. So he had to set something new. So we set up the Noahide laws, then the Mosaic laws. He had this covenant with Abraham. So there's these, what they call, forget what the word is, but there's a word for each of these figures that sort of represents a particular age. And then, of course, the last big name in this sort of progression of dispensations. A dispensation is basically referring to the dispensation of God's grace, his will for his people. And the last dispensation was Jesus Christ. And so basically, when you take sort of this dispensationalist attitude where the possibility of a next sort of prophet or next sort of bearer of God's will, the next sort of herald of God's message, this opens up interesting avenues that you can go down. So now all of a sudden you have people like Joseph Smith can kind of come out of the woods after having his own spiritual experience and say, hey, I've got this new information that we as Christians need to add to the canon, that we've kind of been relying on for so long. So behind Heaven's Gate, you have this actually somewhat long tradition, maybe not, centuries long, but you have sort of an established idea in the United States, particularly, that more will be revealed by God. And there's this sort of like idea that there's sort of this kind of blank space that someone could potentially come to fill as like, hey, I'm the next guy. I'm the next person who's going to get everyone back into the relationship that they're supposed to have with their creator. And in the case of Heaven's Gate, that came in the form of two individuals, which is a little unusual. Usually in these kinds of movements, one person likes to be in charge, but Heaven's Gate doesn't play by the rules like in any respect. They kind of just do their own thing all from top to bottom. So they have these two individuals that come out, Bonnie Nettles and Marshall Applewhite, and they decide, hey, we're from heaven and we've got good news and bad news. The bad news is that the earth is going to come to an end any day now. But the good news is we've got a way out. And their message basically consisted of follow what we say, do what we do, and you can come home with us. You can come back to heaven. So this idea of like, what is a new religion is so tricky in the first place, because these movements don't like to consider themselves new, because that kind of cheapens their sense of legitimacy. One of the things that you'll hear from a lot of these new groups is we're just saying what was always supposed to be said. We're just carrying the message that people were always supposed to hear. but they were blinded by nefarious forces in the world, or they were deluded by self-interest or sin. There's some explanation for why this information is not new, and why it's sort of this like it's revealed information that was always there. That's kind of the attitude that you get in a lot of these groups. Um, so you have like Heaven's Gate citing biblical scripture to justify things that they would do. The level of self-denial that they imposed on themselves, from being celibate to refraining from certain foods, not doing drugs, not drinking. All of this they would try to trace back to scripture, particularly the Gospels. They tended to stay away from the Pauline epistles. They were not fans of the Apostle Paul. They tended to focus primarily on the Gospels and the book of Revelation, which is another common theme in a lot of new religious movements. Revelation is always going to be given a very prominent place in the doctrine. And I think a lot of that is because Revelation is so widely open to interpretation. You can pretty much insert whatever you like into it because it's so cryptic. So the second reason that the new religious stuff is it's difficult to say what is a new religion, because every religion, no matter how new, how quote unquote new it is or how old it is, there's always going to be some history kind of behind it. One of the fascinating things about new religions, one of the reasons I like studying like contemporary religious movements, is because you really get to see that in real time. There's a reason why UFO religions came about in the atomic age. You're not seeing UFO cults like the Raelians and Heaven's Gate and Unarius. You're not seeing anything like that pop up in like, the year 1000. It's very interesting that you only see these movements pop up when, first of all, when space travel was a possibility. And second, when there was all this mass anxiety about imminent annihilation from the bomb. That's why a lot of these movements sprung up in the early 20th century, early mid 20th century. There was all this historical kind of data to pull from, and that ends up shaping and informing every religion. Every religion sort of takes little ingredients from the cultural milieu that it emerges out of to kind of build their belief system. And I think that's one of the reasons I like studying modern religions, is because you get to see that, really, really clearly.
How would you differentiate a religion from a philosophy? And do you think philosophies tend less to borrow from the established tradition?
It's a really good question. But I think we need to understand exactly why this question emerges in the first place. There's sort of this idea that I think a lot of people have that maybe philosophy and religion are just two sides of the same coin. I don't really agree with that, although I think there are good explanations for why people might hold that view. Um, One of the big differences between philosophy and a religion is, first of all, as far as I define philosophy in a couple ways. I would define it as a particular type of activity. Like that's how Deleuze defines philosophy. He defines it as a particular artistic, creative activity. Or I would define philosophy as a particular method for inquiring about the world, a method for arriving at hopefully true statements about the world, about ourselves, about other people, and the relationship between these things. So philosophy is an inquisitive uh, method, I would say. Religion, I don't really look at religion as a method at all. I would look at religion as a kind of belief system, whereas philosophy is a method for acquiring beliefs. So one of the differences between a belief system and a method for acquiring beliefs is typically a belief system begins with beliefs. We start with certain beliefs and then we build on those. which is not to say that there isn't within a given religion any creativity or any inquiring. That's not true at all. I think that I think the formation of religions is itself kind of a creative process. I think it's kind of an art form in itself. So that's not exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying that philosophy is going to involve asking questions, and trying to arrive at those questions using the capacity for reason that I already possess. And hopefully, also, one of the good things about philosophy is we improve our capacity for reason. I when I first started studying philosophy, the arguments I made were terrible. Many times today, still arguments that I make are terrible. One of the cool things about philosophy is it teaches me how to identify exactly what is so bad about the arguments that I come up with. And with religion, it's sort of like when you arrive at the doors of religion, there are certain beliefs that are there waiting for you already. And if you want to keep this religion intact at all, some of these beliefs have to be non-negotiable. So I think you and I have actually talked about this, where, like, if you're going to have Christianity, there are thousands and thousands of different denominations of Christianity, but the centrality of Christ as a figure within that religion is kind of non-negotiable. Like, if you take that element out, you have something else. You have something other than Christianity. Now, you can, within Christianity, you can have all these arguments about who Christ was. You have arguments about, was he fully man? Was he fully God? Was he this? Was he that? Like, you can have all these arguments, but there's never going to be a sect of Christianity that comes in and says, I actually don't believe in Jesus. I have no opinion about him one way or the other. Like, that's not really going to form the basis for any Christian sect. So there have to be certain beliefs that are foundational, that are kind of like not up for debate. And I think that's a big difference between religion and philosophy. To kind of compare the two side by side, I think is kind of a categorical error, because I look at philosophy and religion as being completely different from one another, like categorically. One is a method for acquiring beliefs, and one is a system of beliefs. Now, there are exceptions to this. There are what we could call philosophical systems. I don't think that these systems tend to be created in the same way that religious belief systems tend to be created, but I do think that the existence of philosophical systems is a big part of the reason why people tend to look at them as sort of like they're just really two sides of the same coin. Some examples of like philosophical systems would be like Platonism, Aristotelianism. You had what we called system builders, system building philosophies, like Schopenhauer to some extent, I guess, Kant for sure, Hegel, of course. These were the great system builder philosophers. These were guys who, and they all were working within basically the same cultural milieu. They were all part of the German idealist tradition in the 19th century. And 18th, 19th century, I guess. And what these guys were trying to do was they weren't just like, today you might write a philosophical paper making an argument about, I don't know, why I think reliabilist epistemology is untenable. You might write a paper about that and just tackle one position, take a position on one isolated issue. These guys were like, they wanted to create philosophical systems that did everything. They wanted philosophy to cover science, religion, art, philosophy itself, history, politics. The system building philosophers wanted to create some foundation from which they could derive all of their other beliefs. Now, I don't think that qualifies it as a religion. Like, there's some people that say, like, Marx, I guess maybe some people would consider kind of a system building philosopher, though I wouldn't agree with that. There's been plenty of people that have accused Marxists of belonging to a religion, which I find untenable as a view personally. And I've talked about this in other videos. Um, so when I say that like these guys were building systems, I don't necessarily mean that they were building religions. I think even then you can still distinguish between a philosophy and a religion. I'm really pointing those out because I think there is sort of a resurgence of interest in system building philosophy today, where you have a lot of people that I don't really know why, I don't know where it's coming from, but it seems very um, prolific on the internet in particular, where I encounter all these different like popular philosophers or philosophers that hope to be popular one day, I guess, that want to solve every problem in philosophy ever, for all time, these kinds of philosophical theories of everything. So I think there is sort of a resurgence of interest in that kind of work within philosophy. Um, I'm not a huge fan of that. I think that one of the most important things I've learned about philosophy is that philosophy has limits. And so I personally have no interest in developing a complete system of philosophical starting points from which I can derive all of my actions and all of my thoughts and beliefs. I have no interest in doing that. But I think that is a big reason why people even ask, like, you know, what's the difference between a religion and a philosophy? Is because we're already starting from this assumption that they belong to the same category. But I personally don't think so. And there could be people that disagree with that, and that's fine. But that's sort of the way that I look at it.
What do you think is the catalyst for some of these new systemic philosophies and new religious movements that we've been seeing over the past, say, 50 years?
Um, I think social media and the internet's got a big part to play. Um, when I think about any kind of, contemporary theory of everything philosophy that I've encountered, it's usually either been on Discord or YouTube. Um, this is where I've tended to run into people that are trying to build these new systems of beliefs or arguments, depending on what we're looking at. Um, as far as why beyond the, because social media and the internet kind of might explain the spread of this, and this might bring people together to even talk about it. But I also do think it explains the desire for it. I think I mean, I can only speak from my own limited experience, but people that I've met that are trying to do system building today, they tend to look at other people that have done it successfully, although I guess that even that's debatable, right? But more or less successfully, they look at these big names from the past, like Hegel and Kant, and they say, wow, everyone talks about these guys. I want to be someone that everyone talks about. So I'm going to do that, but I'm going to do it better than they did. And that's fine. So if that's what you want to do, that's okay. Other people, I think they might look at some of these sort of popular pundits, like I don't know. Actually, I don't want to name any names, but like there's certain like popular philosophers, I guess you would call them pop philosophers, that have such a mass appeal that I think a lot of people look at that. They look at these guys up on the stage behind the podium with their names on, books and their names constantly being talked about in the media. And for some people, that sort of becomes this object of desire. Like, I want to be that. I want to do that. Um, that's sort of the cynical view. The less cynical view that we could take is that people genuinely believe that up till now there is some sort of flaw, some sort of missing piece in the puzzle within philosophy, society, culture, religion. Um, you see this in like in the work of guys like John Vervaeke, for example. John Vervaeke is a cognitive scientist who's got a YouTube series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis that came out, I don't know, a few years ago. And he kind of runs through the history of philosophy, a little bit of religion here and there. And he basically kind of is trying to reawaken people's interest in older traditions of belief and practice in response to what he considers the meaning crisis. He never really defines what that is, which is one of the concerns I have about it, I guess. But from what I gather, he basically has this idea that in today's modern society, people are finding it very difficult to find meaning in their lives. You know, the authority of religion in contemporary society has almost completely eroded for most people, not everyone, but for most of society. We are not organizing ourselves around religious ideals anymore. And Nietzsche has pointed this out. Other philosophers have pointed this out, that this comes at a cost. You know, like when Nietzsche says God is dead, and Nietzsche wasn't the first to say this, but he's the guy that we tend to associate with this phrase. And when Nietzsche says God is dead, he's not like it's party time. This is not something to celebrate. This is something that should terrify us, because what he's saying is that we've now lost connection with the very thing that was kind of keeping us intact up here and in here. And now what the heck are we going to do? So what Nietzsche suggests, and I think kind of what Vervaeke is suggesting, and what the existentialists suggested in the 20th century, was find your own meaning or create your own meaning, depending on how you want to phrase it. So maybe to an extent, this drive to system build today is an attempt to construct meaning or find meaning in our lives. The third and last kind of hypothesis, the one that I think I tend to be, I guess, the most sympathetic to, because I am sort of skeptical of stopping our explanations at the search for meaning, because I don't believe that all religious faith can be explained by a desire for meaning. I just don't think that's true. I think that for most religious people, they believe what they believe because they think it's true, not because it's useful, not because it's meaningful, but because they think it's correct. I think that's what most religious, I could be completely wrong about that, but I think that's probably what motivates most religious faith, is the belief that the doctrine is correct. So I kind of have an issue with a lot of this meaning narrative stuff in the first place. I don't know that we can ever know exactly like what goes through someone's mind, like why Applewhite and Nettles decided to get together and start a religion. But by the time they did, they were already having personal religious experiences on their own and together. This is one of the starting points of religion that I find really interesting is religious experiences. People have these unexplainable experiences, these life-changing experiences, these revolutionary moments where the whole way that they look at the world and the way they look at themselves, the way they look at other people changes, and it changes like irrevocably. And you can go a couple of directions there. One is you can go crazy, or you can be called crazy, I guess. You can be labeled crazy. Somebody that has a religious experience and starts thinking, oh, I'm one with the universe, or I'm one with God. Well, depending on who you report this information to might determine where you spend, the next few years. You say that to the wrong person and you end up in a padded room, or you might say it to a group of people that are already sort of established, like you saw in the 1960s, where people were having religious experiences that were sort of stimulated by psychedelics. And then some of them would get locked up because they said the wrong thing to the wrong person, or they did the wrong thing in the wrong place. Then you had other people that had these experiences and they sought out other communities. They sought out people like Alan Watts, Timothy Leary, Ram Dass, or Richard Alpert, as he was then known. They sought out these religious, spiritual leaders who were sort of at the center of these communities of people that could contextualize the experiences and validate the experiences and tell them, hey, what you saw on LSD or DMT or psilocybin or whatever cocktail of psychedelics they had ingested, they would say, hey, the experiences you had on these things are valid, and we want to help you get the most out of them. And one of the reasons I like Ram Dass is because Ram Dass was really the guy at the forefront of this movement in the 60s and 70s that said, hey, what we ultimately want to do is we don't want to have to rely on psychedelics. We want to be able to access this experience, this religious dimension of life without chemicals. That's what we ultimately want to do. And one of the things you see with a lot of Heaven's Gate believers is you have individuals that had already had some sort of spiritual awakening, whatever that might mean to each person. And one of the reasons they were motivated to seek out a group, and a very disciplined group like Heaven's Gate, is because I think on some level, a lot of people who have these spiritual awakening kind of experiences, and on some level, I think they recognize that just having the experience on its own isn't sufficient to guide you for the rest of your life. I think that's sort of a myth that gets kind of propagated in movies and Hallmark cards and stuff like that, that there's going to be one moment that's going to, determine the course of the rest of your life, and you're not going to have to put in any work of your own. I think a lot of people recognize that that's a fantasy. And so a lot of people that joined Heaven's Gate were motivated by this desire for, like, I need to be part of a community of people that are all doing the same thing, that are all looking for the same thing, because I need to be accountable, and I need to hold others accountable, and I need them to hold me accountable. Otherwise, I'm going to lose this connection that I have with whatever this, cosmic grand thing is.
It's interesting that you find Ram Dass very interesting, as you mentioned, he suggests that, we shouldn't need to take these drugs to just be able to experience and learn about these, religious or philosophical systems. And to me, my mind immediately goes to, well, that just sounds like a church. And it's funny that you bring that up, because Nietzsche is talking about how the church is dying, people are losing, and in this contemporary movement, we're seeing, people lose faith in the church. So my question is, it seems like we're almost going through this cycle where people have religious experiences, they establish churches, the churches come to prominence, people lose faith in the church, start forming their own religions, and then we go back to the beginning where people are having religious experiences again. And so the authority of the church kind of is there to talk about God and help people believe in God and to live what the church would say is a good moral life. And so my question for you is, do you think it's necessary to believe in God or to have a higher force to live a good moral life? And what does that even look like?
I actually think I've never really looked at it in terms of looking at an entire life as being moral or immoral. Like, I don't really look at people as being good or bad. I look at the actions people do. I think there are certain people that did lots of bad things, maybe more bad things than good, but I don't really talk about it in terms of like, this is a moral life or this is a immoral life or an evil life. I look more at the actions that people do. Um, as far as whether or not we need belief in God to live morally, to do good, I definitely don't think that's true. Um, I know plenty of people that are atheists that are very nice to people, compassionate, self-sacrificing even. I think that people can be motivated to do good by things other than a belief in God. But maybe there's some people that need it. I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't think that I wouldn't make like a general statement about all human beings and say that, you know, everyone that's alive needs to have this belief or they can't act good or act well.
Maybe you can just describe for our viewers what is morals and how does it differentiate from ethics? Maybe we can go into that a little bit more so we have some definitions from which to base this question from.
Yeah, there are people that separate morals from ethics. I tend to use those terms kind of interchangeably. I have run into conversations where that annoys people. So if I'm in a conversation with someone that wants to distinguish between the two, I usually just defer to them just to, for the sake of a conversation. I personally don't carve any kind of real dichotomy between those words. But if I'm talking to someone who does, what I'll usually do is I'll say, okay, explain to me what the difference is, and then we can kind of continue. Because I have run into, other philosophy students, other philosophy majors who have a very particular sense of the word morals, and then they have a particular sense of ethics, and they distinguish between the two. So I defer to whoever I'm talking to in that case. But me personally, I don't really distinguish between the two. That could change, in time. But as of right now, I don't really. I kind of just use the terms interchangeably.
Interesting. So morals and ethics, you would say, is this term is it's going to differentiate a lot from who you're speaking with.
It can, yeah. I mean, but that's the case with a lot of philosophical conversations. Is that I've had conversations with people where we're using the same terms, but it becomes clear very quickly that we have very different meanings. I think one of the big challenges in philosophical discourse is that there is this sort of language barrier, even amongst philosophers. Um, and that's just sort of, I mean, I think that's kind of just inherent in the discipline. And a big part of the sort of warming up to having a philosophical conversation or a debate with someone, one of the first stages is sort of like, let's establish our terms. What do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? And we might want to hash out like which definition we'll work with. Unless the argument is over definitions, then that changes things. But yeah, I think that's just that to me is not it used to frustrate me, but now I kind of look at it as like this is just part of the difficulty of navigating philosophical inquiry. And if I'm not willing to set aside some time to understand what the other person I'm talking to is saying, then maybe philosophy really isn't for me after all. So I'm willing to, put that work in to make sense of what the other person is saying. Usually,
Kind of
not sometimes
some
I'm not as good about that.
So to kind of sum up this section on morality, this process you describe of defining your terms and refining what people believe, do you think that is kind of how religions are formed?
I think that's how religions evolve because religions don't come into being like fully formed. They come into being in little seeds and then they grow and develop and change over time. And I think in religion there is sort of this process of, I don't know if refinement is the right word, because quite often what you see is sort of an inflation of things, where like look at Heaven's Gate. If you compare the Bible, with the writings of Heaven's Gate believers, there's quite a few things in Heaven's Gate's belief system that are not present in the Bible. One of the big ones is aliens and UFOs. As I don't, I've never come across a translation of the Bible that talks explicitly about extraterrestrials. So, I mean, if there's one out there, I haven't come across it. So I don't know if even refinement is the right word. Um, because again, like sometimes like evolution in religion involves adding things. Um, I mean, that's like a whole other topic. Um, but yeah, I think it's a good thing that you're pointing that out. About like I think that's how religions change over time, is through interactions with other belief systems, through changes in society, changes in technology. Um, there's sort of this dance between religion and culture where it's not necessarily one influencing the other. It's sort of like both of them are kind of uh dancing with one another and playing off of one another. It's not like one directional, which is really interesting, and it's something you see really clearly in modern day religions.
Well, thanks, Matt, for talking about morality in these new religious movements. I think you hit on something very important that hopefully our viewers can take away from this, which is that as religions and religious scholars interact and define these terms, they're kind of evolving. And I like to kind of view that as a symbol of not just a group's transformation, but individuals' transformation. So I'm curious from your perspective of being an expert, I would say an expert on philosophy, what are some ways that you would recommend to people to increase or change or develop the way that they think about life and the problems they're facing?
um I definitely wouldn't consider myself an expert on philosophy,
You're
but
an expert in my mind. You're an expert.
I appreciate that. I I think one of the most important things for people to do to expand their thinking is to spend time with people that think differently from them. I think maybe that's a big reason why I keep coming back to um why I keep coming back to both philosophy and religion. Um Most of the work on my YouTube channel covers philosophers that I really don't I really don't base my life on. Like I have a lot of videos on my channel about Karl Marx. I think I have more videos about him than any other individual on my channel. And I'm not a Marxist. Not yet. I mean, maybe someday. I mean, I've been reading Marx for a number of years and he still hasn't flipped me. So, it could happen, but as of right now, I'm not a Marxist. So a lot of people assume that I am because they think, why would you spend so much time reading a philosopher that you don't agree with? And it's not even just about agreeing or disagreeing. I mean, I'm saying like I don't organize my life around Marxist ideas. What I find interesting about Marx's writings is, at least at first, was almost precisely because of how different the way he thinks is from the way I think. Marx was, very, I mean, Marx is he's materialist through and through. I think I have a pretty big idealist streak still lingering within me. I'm much more sympathetic to beliefs that Marx would have no patience for. Um, but I like reading Marx and I like studying groups of people that think very differently than me and live very differently than me, because every time I spend time with someone whose experience of the world is different from mine, even if it doesn't change my views, um, it changes the way that I relate to other people when I kind of go back home. That actually, this is something I've noticed every time that I sit down and do an interview with someone from Heaven's Gate. This is because I've done several over the last year, and each time that I've come back from one of those, I'm walking on air. I just feel closer to the people in my life. I feel like the world is bigger than I thought it was before. I think I get that anytime I sit down and talk with someone who is committing their life to something. I get that from talking to people that are in 12-step groups. I get that from talking to you and people on the Davison server. Anytime I sit down and talk to somebody who is forging some sort of path forward for themselves in life, anytime I'm talking to people who are actively trying to better themselves, it just gives me such a boost. And I think I'm kind of addicted to it now. It's almost gotten to the point where if I'm not searching out some community to hang out with, at any given moment, I kind of don't feel, I feel like I'm walking around without a shirt on almost. It's like I think I kind of always need to be around people that are on some kind of path. It doesn't even matter what the path is. I'm like, I don't care where we're going. As long as we're going somewhere, I'm always up for an adventure. I think that's kind of what draws me to these groups. And I think that's something that's missing a lot. People are more isolated now than ever, even though, I mean, it's that stereotypical cliche thing, like the more connected we are, the further away we become. Yeah, I think that's true. To a large extent, but it's not hopeless. I think that there are people out there doing things that I can't even imagine. Like when I stumbled across your YouTube channel, I had no idea that there were people trying to start a church around the teachings of Terry Davis. I would have never, that would have never occurred to me. Like that's not something I would have come up with. But here you are, you know. I had no idea how interested I would get in Heaven's Gate and other UFO religions because I've never had much of an interest in cults. I've never had much interest in UFOs. But I think what I am interested in is any people that are trying to that have an idea of what a good life is and they're pursuing it, with all of their energy and all of their focus, and I think maybe the most important thing that I get from sitting down with philosophers that I disagree with, or people from religions or spiritualities that are not opposed to my own beliefs, but are different, um, is it makes me much more comfortable with two things. It makes me more comfortable with people in my life that maybe I don't see eye to eye with. It makes it much easier to navigate disagreements. It's sort of a snowball effect. I think this is one of the big kind of fears that a lot of people have is like, oh my God, I might run into somebody who sees the world differently than me. That would be terrible. No, it wouldn't be terrible. It can be eye-opening, and it doesn't have to change the way that you see the world, but just knowing that there are other ways of looking at things, that there are other perspectives available, and yours isn't the only one. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe it's just a personal thing. I don't know. Maybe I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I like that. You know. I just yeah, I like it.
You like it. Awesome. Yeah,
Hmm.
I think what you described, I don't think just you like it. I think a lot of people feel that way. And I think that's what a lot of people could benefit from some of the videos on your channel because what you're talking about is kind of a universal experience. And so would you say that this quest or this this strive to kind of evolve personally and emotionally, intellectually is one of the most important issues of our time or of all time? Is it something that I do you think how do you think your channel in particular can really help these different people, what is the call to action that you would have?
Okay, yeah, a couple of things come up there. I mean, my call to action with the Heaven's Gate stuff, I think one of them, beyond personal interest, is that um I think that a lot of people have gotten the story about this group's history wrong. And in insofar as a lot of the scholarship and a lot of the films and the podcasts that have kind of been created about this group over the last 25 years have been primarily based on secondhand stuff, third-hand stuff, or in other cases, in cases where people have made an attempt to study the works of this group, almost exclusively they're relying on materials that are available to everyone. Most people are not actively seeking out contemporary current believers in Heaven's Gate, sitting down and asking them, what do you think? What are your beliefs? Why do you do what you do? That's invariably going to produce different kinds of information. There's also a lot of materials that this group created over the years, that is either lost or is very difficult to find. And I'll leave that at that. I don't want to say too much about that, because I don't want to get myself or anyone else in trouble. But there's a lot of materials that I think if people did have access to, a lot of the narratives that have sort of emerged around this group would be challenged. And one of the things I was always taught when I was studying philosophy was two things: was to always keep the conversation moving forward, and two, to look for conversations that people haven't had yet. Look for missing pieces in the story. My favorite school of philosophy, my favorite sub-discipline within philosophy is history of philosophy. And I like history of philosophy because, first of all, it's something that a lot of people don't do. So there's lots of great work to be done because not as many people are doing it. It's also extremely challenging, partly for that reason. But it's also really important because when we get the history of a philosophy or a religion wrong, or we just kind of keep repeating the same narrative and the same story over and over again, we start to veer away from serious inquisitive scholarship to kind of this shock doc kind of stuff, shockumentary type of stuff where, we're propping these people up as like, these people are so weird and they're so dangerous and crazy. Look at them. And it becomes sort of this 21st century freak show kind of thing. And that's always really, really bothered me because we don't treat any other religious groups like that. Why is it okay to treat this group like that? They're a religion just like anyone else. So like when I was taking religious studies courses, your goal was to get as accurate a picture of this group's customs and beliefs as possible, and to always be checking in with yourself about personal biases that you might have. I don't see a lot of people doing that with Heaven's Gate and with so-called cults in general. I think that people kind of generally look at these groups and think that there are certain things that they can get away with in how they talk about these groups that almost no one would get away with talking about other religions. I'm not saying that that's true of everyone. There are a lot of really good role models, that I've looked to, scholars that do really good work on this group, that I'm inspired by and influenced by. And so that's the other part of the call to action, is just this idea of like, this is a group that is still active to some extent, which a lot of people don't even know. And I don't know, it seems like an important group to keep an eye on just in general. If Heaven's Gate is doing something, might be a good idea to keep an eye on what they're doing, and also I just think that new religions have a lot to teach us about ourselves, because like I said at the beginning, any religious system is going to borrow from elements of the culture and the society that it emerges out of. So every time we're looking at Heaven's Gate, it's tempting to focus on how different they are, but they're pulling from elements that all of us are exposed to all the time. They're seeing something different we're all kind of looking at some of the same stuff going on, but they're seeing something different. If that makes sense. So I think the call to action is sort of this idea of keeping the conversation going, and trying to get the story as accurate as possible.
I want to thank you, Matt, for helping us to challenge the narrative and to always, keep the conversation moving forward that we're having internally and externally with others. So thank you, Matt. Everyone, I want to recommend his channel, Varsity Bookworm. I want to thank you again, Matt, for being on the show today.
Thank you, Austin.